Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Planning and Development Council of the Town of Oakville. Madam Clerk, are there any regrets? I don't see any.
No.
Council, do you have any declarations of pecuniary interest? Thank you. Could we have a mover and seconder to resolve into Committee of the Whole? Councillor Johnston, Councillor Robinson, all in favor? Opposed? We are resolved into Committee of the Whole. We have no consent items on this agenda this evening. And the first public hearing item is an already built matter, the public meeting and recommendation report, proposed draft plans of subdivision and condominium, and that's the West Oakville Downtown Homes, Inc. And are there any members of the public here with information for the council on this matter? Council, do you need a presentation or can I look for a motion? Councillor Duddick. Councillor Duddick moves approval. Any discussion? All in favor? It is approved. That brings us to the second public hearing item, which is also routine. The public meeting and recommendation report for the proposed draft plans of subdivision and condominium on Rebecca Street Developments, Inc. Are there any members of the public with information for council on this file? Council, how do you wish to proceed? Councillor Duddick? Councillor Duddick moves approval. Any discussion? All in favor? It is approved. And that brings us to our public meeting report, item number 3. And here we do have a presentation from our planner, Gabe Charles, and this is the proposed zoning bylaw amendment for the Town of Oakville Public Works site. Mr. Charles, council and I are all ears.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. This is a statutory public meeting for a town-initiated amendment to the town zoning bylaw. The town-owned property was the town's former public works sites located northwest of the corner of Glen Ashton Drive and Trafalgar Road. The westerly limit of the site will be bounded by the future extension of Taunton Road, which is intended to extend from Oak Park Boulevard south to Glen Ashton. The property is currently vacant, with the public works operation having been removed a few years ago. The intent of the site-specific amendment is to establish some provisions for a mixed-use zone, which would implement the direction of the current and new official plans in terms of the types of land use and built form expected with any new development on the site. The property is designated mixed commercial residential, which permits a wide range of uses, including commercial and residential uses. The official plan does recognize the future extension of Georgian Drive and Gatwick Drive through the site to Trafalgar Road. It should also be noted that there are some pipelines which cross the southern limits of the property. Although not in full force, the town's new official plan identifies urban core as the land use designation for the subject property. The livable Oakville plan reflects the current OP regarding the types of uses anticipated for the site. No modifications to the livable Oakville plan will be required to implement the zoning amendment. The existing zoning of the site is agricultural, which is one of the few remnant parcels in the uptown so zoned. The zoning being proposed would be a mixed-use zone tailored to the site. We would be looking to include provisions relating to a mix of uses, building height, form, and orientation, setbacks, and parking ratios, among others. In terms of the next steps, staff will evaluate agency and public comments with the intent of providing council with a final recommendation as soon as possible. And if there are questions, we would be pleased to answer those.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charles. Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for the report. A couple of quick questions. First of all, on page 66, and I assume in the proposed bylaw as well, there is a number of specifically permitted uses with some exceptions. I'm specifically referring to the exceptions related to automobile uses. Is it possible to add, for absolute clarity, car dealerships and or car lots in that list of exclusions in light of some past history in the immediate vicinity? Because we had a big argument over what auto-related uses meant back then, and just to bring an abundance of clarity, I'm wondering if we could actually be more specific.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, excuse me, it certainly is possible to be specific with the types of uses we'd permit or not permit.
Are we legally able to get that finite in terms of our limitations? Is that something that we can actually proceed with? Is that, will you take that as direction to, or consideration to revise the recommendation in the future?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we will take that under consideration.
Thank you. Okay. With respect to comments about parking, which is the second bullet on page 67, it refers to commercial, where commercial and/or office units are located, I grade a minimum of one principal building entrance to each unit shall be directly accessible from and oriented towards a public street. So does that basically mean that anybody that lives along Taunton Road will not have a parking lot immediately adjacent to their property? Because we have residential all along, proposed for Taunton, we have residential on the other side. Does this provision avoid any parking lots along Taunton Road that are publicly visible or that are visible from the residential areas?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, one of the provisions that we're considering is one which would not allow a surface parking area permitted in a yard between a building and a street. The idea being that we get buildings as close to the street as possible to try to create that urban room that we're trying to achieve with an animated streetscape. That's our goal. In terms of actual parking in front, it's possible parking could be permitted on the right-of-way itself, but certainly our direction is to try and avoid having parking lots facing the streets, but it's something that we'd be very specific about once we got into a site plan situation.
Is it possible to include that in the zoning, that we avoid that now so that we don't have a big bun fight when we're dealing with it at the point of application?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it is in the appendix currently. It is one of the items that we've listed. The exact number of that is failing me right now. I'm not finding it quickly, but certainly it is something that we'll take under advisement again.
Now,
Any more advice for staff?
yeah, I have something else here. So I just for absolute clarity and for anybody that might be watching on Town TV, and I do see at least one individual in the audience from the community, the height of the building is expressed strictly in linear measure as opposed to stories. Can we be clear as to what is contemplated by a maximum of 41 meters? I'm assuming that would be 10 floors plus main, so 11 floors. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, 41 meters is what we calculate for a 12-story building as the
12.
maximum.
Okay.
So that's the direction that we're taking straight out of the official plan, both the current as well as the new plan.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear with that in case anybody's watching this. And I think that was all the questions I had for right now. Oh, yes, sorry, there's one more. So the other point in the second paragraph on page 67 is with respect to residential retail and or office. You talk about the Uptown Court plan contemplates, we've always contemplated street access or street presence for our retail and businesses, and we continually get into this scenario where the developers are delivering traditional plaza-style proposals. Big parking lot in front of retail, and even when we try to move the parking or move the entrances onto the main streets, we always end up getting right back to the same old story. Can we clearly address that in this particular proposal? It looks like you're contemplating that here, but can we be very specific about trying to get some street-oriented retail and commercial here?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, one of our intents is to ensure that we have a maximum building setback to the street. You'll see that in the schedule where the minimum setback is 1 meter, the maximum is 3 meters from the street. In addition to that, the idea of having at least one principal entrance to the street and having a minimum requirement of the amount of building along the street is to achieve exactly what you're looking for. We'll certainly look at a number of different options to ensure that the greatest clarity with that.
In terms of the entrance, though, I mean, one of the things that some of these proposals in the past have done is they've provided an entrance, but it's not the main entrance. So they provide an entrance on the main street, yet that's not the main entrance to the building. Can we get as fine-grained as that to stipulate that we want the main entrance off of the main public street, or is that getting too detailed in terms of the zoning?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's certainly something that we've been pushing for with other developments in the uptown to deal with that exact issue. In terms of how specific we get and legally how far we can push it, it'll be something that we'll look at.
So you'll review that as well with the other considerations and report back on the next round. Thank you very much. That's great. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor. Any others? Councillor Adams.
I think the two of us are about to ask the same question. Can you tell us what the effect of the pipeline crossings is?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, really what it entails is it effectively freezes a chunk of land where the pipeline would be located underground, and just to ensure that there's a reasonable setback from those, and we would work with the utility companies to make sure that we have those appropriate setbacks.
Does that setback show up anywhere within our zoning? So I don't think I saw it within the page 76, 77 zoning. Is it in some parent document or some other document this refers to?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's not located in the provisions as is. The intent of these provisions was to give a general flavor as to the direction we were going in or that we're thinking about for the site. But again, it's something that we would speak with utilities about to ensure that we have the right setbacks.
So they would be utility specific, they wouldn't be within a zoning bylaw? Is that what you're
Correct.
saying? So is there within the, I don't know what the utility act is that's relevant here, but is within that, are there guidelines or regulations that dictate what the setbacks must be?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there are requirements of the different utility companies. I can't say for certain that they're all exactly the same amongst the different utilities themselves, but in terms of putting that right into the bylaw, that's something that we'll discuss with them.
But that'll come back.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Khan?
In our ward, we had a similar situation as well, where because there was an easement or a pipeline going underneath, we couldn't plant trees and we couldn't pave a road over top without doing significant modifications. So do you know whether or not at this time there will be any implications of that pipeline being there as to what can properly be built in the future?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, not sure right now of any restrictions that would come with that. Generally, from what we've seen, it's a requirement for a setback, or at least a separation from the location of the pipelines.
Council does understand that this is an item for receipt. We're not making any decisions tonight. Councillor Knoll for a second time.
I think we're just trying to add some value to the whole process. The my second round question I forgot in the first time was there's a contemplation, always has been, of an extension of Georgian and Gatwick through this property directly through Trafalgar. Does anything in this particular proposal mandate that, or is that simply something that would be considered at the time of application?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, both roads are intended to extend through to Trafalgar. It's reflected in both the official plans that we have right now.
Right. So that's a done deal at this point. There's no getting around the extension of those two roads at this point?
Well, the intent will be to put it through. If there comes back some comments as to the rationale that it shouldn't be going through, then we'll have to look at those.
Because I do know that was one of the issues around the last, when the property was previously sold, the applications came forward. I know that was one of the issues that we dealt with, was whether or not those roads would actually occur or not, or actually be put in place. So, and there's some concern, I think, in the community as well about a pass-through to Trafalgar Road in terms of accessing the individual streets. So, but it's it could be something that would be considered at the time of an application. Is that accurate, or is that fair?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, In terms of the actual ownership of the road, that's something that could probably be up for discussion, whether it's a public road or a private road. Certainly with the previous application, at least one of the roads was supposed to be public, the other one may have been a condominiumized road. So there's certain restrictions you can put in place if it is condominiumized. As well, we would need to work with the region to ensure that any access that was be going through would be safe, appropriately separated from other intersections, since it's the Trafalgar Road's under the region's jurisdiction. So those are all things that we'll be able to look at.
But I'm just trying to, I'm sorry if I'm not understanding you. I just want to be really clear here. Are the two roads a done deal, or are they subject to consideration at a future time?
I think the proper answer is by having provided for them in the official plan, we can insist upon them if we want to or need to at the time, but we don't necessarily have to. So it's roads if necessary, but not necessarily roads. This being the classic Canadian solution for all problems.
That's what I was looking for. So that's a reasonable approach, or the mayor's conclusion is I guess what is being contemplated as well by staff at this point?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Another second timer, Councillor
you.
Adams.
I'm looking on page 74 where we've got our livable Oakville plan. It doesn't show the roads there, but it does show them in the previous page. Is there any difference between the two, having them shown and not shown?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think quite simply it was just a mapping error because this captured the uptown as well as the central area that was in the plan. But it is illustrated, though the roads are illustrated on the schedules to the livable Oakville plan.
Okay, so they are in the schedules. And so when it returns to council again in the future, will you give consideration to this issue of the effect of the pipeline in terms of what an appropriate built form would be at the corner? Because you're going to have this unusual cut on the diagonal at the southeast corner, leaving a very small parcel there. And I wonder whether that corner parcel, which is in effect an entry point to the community, whether that should have some special planning for it of some sort. Don't know what it should be, but it seems different.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's certainly something that we need to look at. We need to understand what amount of land will be left once we take into account the location of the pipelines and any appropriate setbacks. And from there, we'll be able to provide some direction to any future development in terms of form, height, uses, all of those things.
Thank you. I'm satisfied I'll get a full report on those things.
Any others? Thank you very much, Mr. Charles. Are any members of the public with information for council on this file? Council, how do you wish to proceed? Councillor Knoll.
I'll move the staff recommendation, Your Worship.
Councillor Knoll moves the recommendation, which is receipt. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That carries. That brings us to item number 4, the draft plan of condominium. This is the Bronte Creek Community Limited Phase 2A. Are there any members of the public with information for council on this item? Is there any need by a member of council for the presentation that Ms. Stan is here with? Council, how do you wish to proceed with this item? Councillor Elgar.
I'll move the staff recommendation.
Councillor Elgar moves the staff recommendation. Any discussion? All in favor? It is carried. That brings us to item number 5, the draft plan of condominium for Bronte Creek Community Limited Phase 2B. Same question to the public. Any members of the public with information for council on this item? Any member of council wishing the presentation on this phase? Council, how do you wish to proceed? Councillor Elgar.
It's almost like the mirror image. I'll move staff recommendation.
Thank you very much, Councillor. All in favor? That carries. That brings us to our discussion items. And the first discussion item, item number 6, is the notice of intention to demolish 171 Chisholm Street. The recommendation from the planning services regarding the notice of intention is that it be received. Carolyn Van Splichtenhorst is here if you have questions, but first let me ask, are there any members of the public here with information for council on this item? Is there a member of council who has a preference how to proceed? Councillor Adams?
I'll move the recommendation.
Councillor Adams moves the recommendation of receipt. Discussion, all in favor? It carries. Number 7 is the Places of Worship Land Use Study, and the motion before council, the recommendation from staff is receipt. And as I understand it, we have a number of people with in the audience tonight with information for council. And we also have a presentation from Brad Sunderland.
And the addendum,
Pardon?
supplementary report.
And there's a supplementary report. So we will turn our attention to Brad Sunderland and receive all, and we'll be enlightened by all of that information. Then we'll turn to the public, and then we'll turn to council. Mr. Sunderland, we are all ears.
Just load up the presentation for you first. So good evening, Your Worship and members of council. Just a brief introduction. I've never stood before council before. So my name is Brad Sunderland, and I'm a planner with the Long Range Planning section. And tonight I will be presenting the Place of Worship Land Use Study. So in tonight's presentation, I'll take you through the background of the study process, some of its key findings, and staff's recommendations. So the need for a Place of Worship Land Use Study was identified during...
Excuse me, please, Mr. Sunderland.
Yeah.
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you, and I'm going to check with the audience to see if I have any allies wanting your mic turn. Oh, I have support on this.
All right.
So if we could get Mr. Sunderland's mic trimmed, and/or Mr. Sunderland to...
Speak into the mic.
Yeah. Maybe the two measures together, and then if you wouldn't mind just restarting.
Okay.
Thank you.
So just to do a presentation overview, tonight's presentation, I'll take you through the background of the study process, some of the key findings, as well as staff's recommendations. So the need for a Place of Worship Land Use Study was identified during the Livable Oakville work program. This work program was used to create the town's new official plan, the Livable Oakville Plan. A policy in the Livable Oakville Plan committed the town to complete a study. The purpose of the study was to assess the suitability of place of worship policies in all land use designations, with a goal to create appropriate policies and regulations for places of worship. The work plan for the Places of Worship Land Use Study began after the adoption of the Livable Oakville Plan in June of 2009. In October 2009, staff met with the Interfaith Council of Halton. This meeting was held to discuss the Livable Oakville Plan policies and address concerns. At this meeting, staff collected information on the activities conducted at places of worship in Oakville, as well as future plans. The list of activities and future plans received was extensive and demonstrated the diversity of uses and programs offered and planned for. To kick off the study, a stakeholder advisory committee was formed to help staff develop an appropriate approach to the study process and provide staff with insight from a faith group's perspective. The committee was made up of various faith leaders from faith groups across Oakville and provided a primary source of contact for keeping faith groups informed of the study and study process. A workshop was held in May of 2010. The workshop was attended by approximately 35 people representing various places of worship across Oakville, residents associations, and other interested parties. The workshop discussed key policy approaches that could be used for places of worship. The workshop identified different opinions about appropriate policy direction for places of worship. Some people identified they would prefer to have broad land use permissions to accommodate places of worship and any future activities that may be associated with them, while others preferred to have more control mechanisms in place to ensure compatible development within their respective neighborhoods. The Places of Worship Land Use Study was released to the public on February 7th, 2011. Since that time, staff have met with the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, residents associations, and held a public open house to present the study findings, its recommendations, and ask for feedback. The findings from these consultation events are discussed later. So the first thing the study looked at was the physical and locational context of places of worship within the town. Oakville has a total of 65 places of worship. Within the livable Oakville planning area, which is the area south of Dundas Street and north of Highway 407, there are 56 places of worship. The land use map on this slide shows the area south of Dundas Street. The place of worship sites in this area are outlined in either red or blue. Red indicates sites greater than 2 hectares in size, and blue indicates less than 2 hectares in size. Places of worship found here are generally along regional, arterial, and collector roads. This can be attributed to past policies which directed places of worship to locate in these areas, as well as other considerations such as traffic, access, parking, and visibility. South of the QEW, places of worship are generally on smaller sites, and as you move northward, places of worship sites become more dispersed and are generally on larger sites. Within this area, the majority of places of worship are located within residential land use designations. This distribution reflects the policies of the current plan, which promoted smaller scaled places of worship within residential neighborhoods. Approximately 70% of places of worship in the livable Oakville plan area are on sites less than 1 hectare, which is approximately 2.5 acres. 18% are on sites greater than 2 hectares, which is 5 acres. This demonstrates that historically, places of worship were built on smaller sites and at smaller scales. Within the North Oakville East and West Secondary planning areas, which is the area north of Dundas Street and south of the 407, there are a total of 9 places of worship. The places of worship located in Oakville's historical settlements along Dundas Street, which include Munn's Corners near 6th Line and Palermo Village at Bronte Road, they are on smaller sites. Places of worship which are outside of the historical settlements are generally on larger sites along existing concession roads in the rural area. The larger sites are likely due to the availability of rural land at less cost. The study looked at the emerging development trends of places of worship through a review of literature and other studies that have been completed on places of worship. The study found that as the population becomes more diverse, so does the diversity of places of worship. This leads to an increase of various facility requirements. The study found that places of worship follow similar growth patterns, often following 4 general stages of growth. This ranges from faith communities starting out in temporary rental accommodations in community centers or meeting space in people's homes, moving up to more permanent rental locations such as commercial or employment spaces, or a faith group doubling up in an existing place of worship, moving up to the construction of a place of worship, and finally the expansion of a place of worship. This general approach to development varies between faith groups and is largely dependent on the faith group's organizational structure. The literature identifies that there are both local and regional drawing places of worship. The differentiation between these scales is generally based on population dispersion of its congregants, the size of places of worship, and the population which can be accommodated in the facility. Findings suggest that more places of worship are opting to build regional drawing places of worship, which are larger in scale and can serve larger communities. Many places of worship are also locating in employment areas more frequently to meet economic constraints faced by faith groups, to locate in areas with vacant sites, be centrally located, and as a result, minimize impacts on residential areas due to parking and traffic. Uses associated with places of worship are evolving, which can create land use compatibility issues with adjacent sites. These uses include things such as housing, banquet halls, and schools. Places of worship programs are seen to complement public services and fill in gaps where services may not be offered. And finally, places of worship development often face traffic and parking constraints due to peak traffic volumes of these uses, as well as parking for special events and holidays. The provincial, regional, and local policy documents noted here were reviewed as part of the study. Many of these documents provide policies and directions which must be achieved. The policies in these documents generally indicate that a portion of new development must be directed to the existing built-up area through intensification and directed towards urban growth centers, intensification corridors, and major transit station areas. The documents consider places of worship as an institutional use, which are permitted in most areas, including residential, commercial, mixed use, and employment areas. Different scales of institutional uses are recognized. Larger scale uses are directed toward higher intensity areas, such as growth areas and areas adjacent to arterial roads. Special attention is given to institutional uses in employment areas due to the sensitive land uses, compatibility issues, potential adverse impacts, and the protection of employment lands. Opportunities for intensification and redevelopment are encouraged and are to take into consideration existing building stock in areas, infrastructure, and public service facilities required. The analysis of best practices indicates that other municipalities use policy approaches similar to the one in the Livable Oakville Plan. These approaches include separate policy frameworks for local and regional drawing places of worship, as well as site size considerations and compatibility criteria. Other approaches identified through the best practice review, which are not used in Oakville, include a two-tier approach for treating uses associated with places of worship, such as accessory and auxiliary uses, the use of reserved sites for places of worship, which predetermine locations for places of worship, and policies which restrict places of worship in employment areas. Within Oakville, a number of recent and proposed places of worship developments and developments associated with them were examined and are listed here. The findings from these examples confirm that development patterns identified in the emerging trends are being seen throughout the town. This includes larger place of worship facilities on larger sites than previously seen, a diversification of facilities by faith group, more uses being proposed in association with the main place of worship use, such as housing and cultural schools, and places of worship choosing to locate in employment areas. Based on the research and study findings, the place of worship land use study proposed draft modifications to the Livable Oakville Plan and directions for the zoning bylaw to be considered through the comprehensive zoning bylaw review process. The study also recommends the development of urban design guidelines and standards in coordination with the comprehensive zoning bylaw review. The study does not recommend amendments to the North Oakville Secondary Plan or North Oakville zoning bylaw, as the policies and regulations in these documents provided the flexibility needed for place of worship development. Upon the completion and public release of the study, staff held additional public consultation opportunities to present the study findings, recommendations, and seek comments. At the Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting, the committee expressed that the proposed modifications effectively provide opportunities for the development of places of worship through all stages of their development and provided increased flexibility within the policy framework. It was noted that the policy modifications were a step in the right direction. The committee raised concerns, however, with regard to some of the proposed directions of the zoning bylaw review. Staff informed them that these directions will be subject to further public input and consultation during the comprehensive zoning bylaw review program. At the Residents Association meeting and public open house, many residents wanted assurance that the proposed modifications would not permit the construction of high-density housing in association with a place of worship, and that any development of that sort would still be subject to the underlying land use designation, zoning, and compatibility criteria established. Town staff provided assurance to residents that the modifications did not impact the plan's approach to intensification, and the modifications would not alter the requirement for the underlying land use designation policies, compatibility criteria, or zoning regulations to be met. At the meetings, a concern was also raised that the proposed modifications to permit places of worship in commercial units should be subject to the proposed implementing zoning regulations before policies permitting this type of arrangement are pursued. This was to ensure that the appropriate regulations are in place first before a policy is considered. In light of this comment, the draft proposed modifications presented in the land use study have been further modified and are reflected in Appendix B of the supplementary staff report. This means that proposed modification 7.1.2K in the place of worship land use study has been excluded from the recommendations before council and will be considered through the comprehensive zoning bylaw review to ensure proper regulations are in place first to address circumstances where places of worship are within multi-use developments. Other concerns raised at the meeting included the definition of place of worship to include the word physically, to ensure that congregants physically assemble at places of worship. As well, concerns over the consistency between the definitions in the zoning bylaws and the inclusion of regulations regarding permitted heights of places of worship be considered. Many of the concerns identified through the public consultation process have been addressed in the recommended Livable Oakville Plan modifications, and others will continue to be looked at during the comprehensive zoning bylaw review. As a conclusion to the place of worship land use study, staff proposed the following recommendations. So one, in the original staff report, that the report be received. In the supplementary staff report, that it be received also, and that council instruct staff to present the proposed modifications to the Livable Oakville Plan to the Ontario Municipal Board as they modify the policies in the plan which have been addressed through the places of worship land use study. And finally, that the places of worship land use study conclusions and the consultation to date provide direction to the comprehensive zoning bylaw review program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sunderland, for your presentation. Are there members of council with questions for Mr. Sunderland? Councillor DeMoff.
I know you discuss, through your worship, actually, first I want to thank you for all your work that you put into the study. There were two issues that I know came up in terms of the size of the 2.5 hectares and what the intent of the zoning has to come after the plan is in place. What happens with groups who, there's going to be a time delay there, with groups who may want to rent a unit in a commercial development that is over the 2.5 hectares? They'll be restricted from being able to do that if they're just a small organization. Is that correct?
Until the zoning bylaw would be in place, that would be correct. Unless the policies of the current plan would permit it otherwise, which I don't believe it does.
So if I can just help add to Mr. Sunderland's response. Under the current zoning bylaw, those facilities would be bound by the zoning that's in place until such time as the new comprehensive zoning bylaw is put in place. So if they're currently operating in a multi-use plaza, whether it's in a commercial or an employment setting, they would be continued to do so long as that use is permitted, which in most cases it is. And when the new zoning bylaw directing some of these size regulations come into place, that would be the point at which they would have to confront that if the size restrictions are not those which would match them in terms of the 60% that I think, or the 40%.
40%.
That Brad referred to.
And then the other question had to do with the special needs housing. The region has in their plan that special needs housing is subject to reasonable planning standards and design criteria. So how does that differ from what we're proposing to be putting in our, or that's in the staff recommendation that we've been presented with tonight?
It doesn't. ROPA 38 does not have any status even in terms of an approval by the province at this stage. They're still awaiting a decision. The pending policies or the direction are that the special needs housing as defined by the region be permitted as you mentioned with reasonable planning criteria. Our current plan does that. Our Livable Oakville plan does that. So there would be, in our view, as Brad indicated, an assurance to the community that that would continue.
Thank you, Councillor DeMoff. Others? Councillor Khan?
Thank you very much for your report. Can you tell me a little bit more about your definition here of places of worship that you want to put in? For instance, I mean, you can have, and I've seen this often, where you can have a cultural center that might have a room for worship, or vice versa. You can have the whole building is for worship, and you might have accommodations for one of the religious figures. So how do we make that distinction?
So through the directions that are proposed for the zoning bylaw is to ensure that the main place of worship, so the assembly area, would be larger than any other type of facility that would be attached to it. So it wouldn't necessarily, it would allow for your cultural schools or that sort of thing to be on the same site as the place of worship. But it's to identify that scale of what is the main use, really. And the main use is the place of worship use, and then all those other uses which would be accessory to that, but would still be permitted to.
So that's more subjective, or do you actually take, square foot area, or do you actually take, capacity? What are we looking at?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. In the directions for the zoning, it doesn't currently consider square footage of these facilities. It just recognizes that the accessory use to the main place of worship use should be smaller than the main assembly area. So that is something that we could consider through the zoning bylaw review exercise.
Thank you, Councillor Khan. Are there, Madam Clerk, would you call the first delegation?
The first delegation is Reverend Dr. Maura Murray Hayes, here representing the Interfaith Council of Halton.
Welcome, Dr. Murray Hayes. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, Your Worship and members of Council, I'm here to thank you for mandating this study and to express the Council's appreciation for the very complex work that has been going on for the last year and a half or so by the Planning Department, who have worked very hard, as you've heard, consulting with representatives of the whole community, in particular the faith groups and neighborhood associations. And as they have indicated, they've consulted with best practices in other communities and held public hearings. So we are very appreciative of the complexity of their task and believe that this report is a remarkable effort in holding together diverse interests. The Interfaith Council represents all of the presently 9 faith groups in this community, and we are aware that there may be other faith groups in the future whose interests we are also seeking to protect. And so we thank the Planning Department for their work in preserving the quality of life of all citizens of faith of our town. So we, in general, support the modifications to the Livable Oakville plan as set out within Appendix G to the study. There are a couple of recommendations that we have difficulty with in the supplemental staff report, and I'm going to ask our solicitor, Mr. Blair Taylor, if he'll address those two concerns.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray Hayes. Mr. Taylor, welcome. Council looks forward to your ministrations.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of Council. I am speaking tonight on behalf of not only the Interfaith Council, but also the Halton Presbytery of the United Church of Canada. And so I will be addressing 2 issues and have 1 comment. So if I may turn first to my first issue, and that, if I can use the overhead, hopefully they can pick this up. I'll be speaking to one of the items from the, can you zoom in on that, please? Otherwise, none of us will be able to read it. And if you could turn the lights down, that'll even help us more. Oh, too far. Back up a little bit. Tell you what, I'll pull it over there. Thank you. That's great. What I have before you is the appendix to the Places of Worship study that has been addressed to you. These contain the 5 modifications that are recommended as part of Livable Oakville. And the one I have circled and highlighted is the one that talks about the places of worship that are on a site designated for employment or commercial uses, a school site or a community facility, which is greater than 2.5 hectares. Now, we draw this to your attention because this is the one recommended modification that's not being implemented in the supplementary staff report. And so this will be the one that we recommend to you, that we support what's in the Places of Worship study and distinguish it from the supplemental staff report that you have before you. The objective of this policy is to allow startup places for places of worship in a plaza, in a school, in a rec center, somewhere where they can get started. And the size of that facility, the greater facility, is more than 2.5 hectares in size, and it's desirable to be able to do this. And so we recommend that it be in the official plan now, and that subsequently, when the zoning bylaw comes, that the zoning bylaw be drafted so as to implement this. And I would suggest to you that that is absolutely in concert with the rest of livable Oakville, because you have adopted a whole series of modifications to the already council-adopted livable Oakville. It's at the Ontario Municipal Board, and the zoning bylaw is coming sometime later. And so our suggestion to you in terms of dealing with this is it makes absolute sense to deal with it in the same way, the same fashion as you're dealing with the rest of livable Oakville. So that was my issue number one. I'd like to turn to issue number two, and it relates to the special needs housing, and it arises out of the again, out of the study. And the study cites a number of examples where places of worship have also been able to provide special needs housing. And for all of us who are approaching the baby boomer generation and think about moving on or have experienced the difficulty of finding a placement for a loved one in our family, you can understand how difficult that is. You can understand that the number of placements is very modest, and that this is something that the places of worship are able to do and should be able to do. Now, I'm going to put before you, and hopefully my friend at the back, excellent. What I'm showing you is an extract that's found in Appendix A, and it's from the region of Halton, and it deals with the regional official plan being 2006. And in section 8611, it's highlighted there that it's the policy of the region to permit intensification of land use for residential purposes such as infill, redevelopment, conversion of existing structure, provided that the physical character of the existing neighborhoods can be maintained. That's an existing policy of the regional official plan. So too is 8622. It is the policy of the region to require local official plans and zoning bylaws to permit special needs housing in all residential neighborhoods subject to reasonable planning standards and design criteria. Now, I have pointed out, and the question has arisen with regard to ROPA 38, which makes 8622 as being a matter of as of right. And that you've already heard the discussion on, so I'm going to restrict myself simply to the Regional Official Plan 2006. And here's where the disconnect comes. The disconnect comes with regard to the commentary in terms of the modifications. And this is from the supplemental staff report. And it indicates that any proposed changes to the underlying land use designation and/or zone would require the appropriate official plan or zoning bylaw amendments through the public planning process. And this, we suggest, is the disconnect that exists between what is in the supplemental staff recommendation and within ROPA 2006. So our submission is that the special needs housing should be a matter that's in every residential designation and every residential zoning bylaw as being an allowed use. So those are my two issues, and I'm down to my one comment, and the one comment that I wish to make relates to the forthcoming zoning bylaw, because the study talks about changes coming in the forthcoming zoning bylaw, and the study talks largely in terms of concepts, in terms of where that's going. And obviously, we have to make a reservation here to say that all we've seen to date are those policy directions. We haven't seen the actual document. And so we have to reserve our comments and say, we look forward to seeing the actual document, we look forward to the opportunity to review it, to have discussions with staff, and then to make submissions, if necessary, on the zoning bylaw. So, Your Worship, those are all my comments at the present time, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you might have at this time.
Thank you. I'll just assure you that in the 3 to 4 years' worth of work that lies ahead of us in conforming the zoning bylaw to the new OP, I imagine we'll see you quite often, and I don't expect you'll ever want for chances to talk to us. Councillor Khan has a question for you.
First, I want to thank you for all the opportunities you've provided, and I have to tell you that, seriously, we do look forward to working with you on this. These are not easy matters. There are very unique and individual circumstances that arise, and we get into some very, very interesting threshold issues. Special needs housing. I mean, I unfortunately had to deal with that with my parents, and it's a situation that I think we all have to go through and understand the difficulty that arises therefrom. So,
On behalf of council, I thank you for the compliment, and Councillor Khan now has a question for you.
Okay, I was going to ask a question, but unless you guys want to hug something first, I'll defer the question. Blair, the question I have is, it's going back to the places of worship definition. If you do have special needs housing, presumably that will be a larger size than the institution itself, where the actual worshiping occurs. Will that then take it out of the definition of place of worship, and what are the consequences of that?
I don't know the actual physical size. I mean, the one that obviously jumps to mind the easiest is the Glen Abbey United Church, when you have both the United Church and the residential accommodation next door to it. And I simply don't know the numbers on the size of the church with its entire facility versus what's next door, but it was always a planned opportunity with regard to that. I guess the next one that jumps quickly to mind is St. Luke's Anglican, which is now in process. Again, a planned exercise in terms of the whole provision of the retirement residential setting. And I was trying to think of one other one, and I'm not sure of this, but the one that's next door to Mary Mother of God up on Oak Park on the east side, there is the Catholic Church. Postridge. There is the Catholic Church, and then abutting it to the north, I believe, is another retirement community. But I don't know if the two are associated. No? It's completely separate, they just abut? But those are the ones that jump quickly to mind, but I'm afraid, Councillor, I don't know the actual dimensions of those facilities to be able to answer that. I know in the Glen Abbey case, a severance was required, and that was required and facilitated the actual construction of the retirement residence.
Actually, I was thinking about St. Luke's, and that was my concern there. If, I mean, it would appear to me that it might very well be greater than the place of worship itself. And in that case, would you not want staff to reconsider the definition of place of worship?
I hear behind me the answer of yes. And so I'll take that as instruction.
Well done, Councillor.
Always listen to your clients.
If I could just make an additional comment. I think there's a ministry in Burlington that has not been looked at, but Carpenter Hospice is actually attached to St. Stephen's United Church in Burlington. It has more space. It pays $1 a year to the church for that space, provides an incredibly important ministry. I don't think anybody in that environment would not see that as part of the ministry of that place of worship. So the issue of 50% is not going to be helpful for places of worship who seek to provide that kind of ministry to their community.
Thank you very much for your information this evening.
Thank you.
And is that it? Do you have any others listed? Are there any other members of the public with information for council on this file tonight? Thank you. All right, council, how do you wish to proceed? Councillor Knoll.
Your worship, can we ask staff to respond to the two issues that are raised by Mr. Taylor, specifically the one that I'm curious to understand a little bit better is the modification change from the original report to the addendum report of the removal of K. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about that and the implications thereof, because I do know that there are some, I guess, temporary renter type of churches that would be, I think, concerned what the implications of removing that are. So I'd like to understand that a little bit better.
Right, and you saw the discussion in the report detailing the Residents Association's concerns with respect to this, right?
I did, and I'd just like to have some more understanding of what the, by removing it from the recommendation, what the implications are, I guess, on those particular types of facilities, many of which already exist, and what the long-term plan is to deal with those.
Ms. Anderson?
Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Knoll, this issue was discussed at length through both the public consultation process and in finalizing the supplementary report to Council. And it was believed that based on the variations in terms of places of worship in combination with other uses, as well as in different locational contexts, is best addressed through the zoning bylaw. And in fact, the original modification was basically saying that, and it doesn't need to say that. And so it's better addressed through the zoning, where we can identify and provide that level of detail and interpretation, rather than trying to provide that through a policy in the plan that speaks broadly to community uses.
So the intent by removing that is not in any way to move towards removing that ability in the bylaw. So we shouldn't be interpreting it as nefarious. It's simply a matter of putting it where it belongs.
Yes, and putting it where it belongs, and in fact clarifying that that's not the intent.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Demoff.
Just one more clarification, if I could please, is the intent is not to not allow, sorry, I've got a double negative there. We're not trying to stop special needs housing, but simply to have it conform to the zoning that's in place where the plan is to build it. That was the understanding that I got. Can you just clarify that for me? It's not to stop special needs, to make sure that it's conforming to the zoning that's in place.
So through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Damoff, the intention with special needs housing, and I should correctly point out that in the current plan, special needs housing does conform with the regional 2006 plan. We do provide for special needs housing in all urban residential designations, and that is not proposed to change at all. And as well, in terms of livable Oakville, there's no proposed modifications to that. Special needs housing coming forward would be provided in accordance with the policies in the current plan and with livable Oakville once approved. The zoning would be detailed upon approval of livable Oakville in terms of specific details around that issue. But it's not the intent to exclude or preclude that at this stage.
So to assist the public who may not have been able to hear because of the faulty microphone, the planning director gave a detailed yes to the question. Thank you, planning director. Council, I look for a councillor who wishes to move a motion. Councillor Bird moves the staff recommendations, which were on the screen briefly before. Do you want me to repeat it, or does everybody recall it well? I see no demand for repetition. All in favor? Opposed, if any? It is carried. Thank you very much. That brings us to Ms. Leslie Gill Woods, who has a presentation on item 8, the Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital Lands Study Update. And Ms. Gill Woods, we are all ears.
Thank you. Oh, the green button. Here we go. Good evening. I'm here to give you an update about the OTMH land study as we're about to enter the design phase of the study. As you may recall, Livable Oakville designates the hospital site as institutional. It's further identified as a special policy area and potential residential redevelopment area. The site-specific policies in the plan say that redevelopment would be permitted in accordance with the permitted uses and policies of the low-density residential designation. However, medium-density residential uses and community uses may also be permitted. The intent is that the overall density would be low, and the maintenance and preservation of the old Oakville Trafalgar High School building, which is designated under the Heritage Act, is also encouraged in those policies. The plan stipulates that before any redevelopment can be considered for this site, a town-initiated community visioning exercise must take place. So this study is a strategic opportunity for the town to work with the community to find the most appropriate redevelopment concept for the lands in advance of council's decision whether or not to exercise its option to purchase the lands. Phase 1 of the study focused on community visioning. Last year we had a community visioning workshop that was attended by about 85 people, and we designed discussion questions to seek input that would help us to guide the creation of redevelopment concepts for the site. So the questions focused on key factors and contextual considerations, key strengths of the OTMH site, as well as key weaknesses or challenges, and key opportunities associated with the OTMH site. I apologize for the typo. And that input was quite varied and compiled into a summary document that's attached to the report as Appendix B, and it's also been available online for some time. When you read it, I'm sure you appreciated the range of views that were shared at the workshop. We heard ideas about a variety of housing options for the OTMH lands, as well as ideas about potential healthcare and community uses. One thing that was recognized at the community visioning workshop was the interest on the part of stakeholders and the participants in seeing what could happen on other potential redevelopment sites in the surrounding area. And to address that interest, we'll be looking at the broader area in the context of the OTMH study. So this illustrates, this takes Appendix B from the report and just clarifies a few things. The special policy area is intended to remain intact, and that's the portion of, that's the existing OTMH lands bounded in blue. The existing long-term care building on the site will eventually have its own parcel, and the boundary of that parcel is yet to be determined. The area in green is the area where we're really going to focus the redevelopment concepts. And then the areas in red are the expanded study areas. So those are the lands that the community identified as other areas of potential change. So you see the two medical buildings, Wallace Park, the Curling Club, and Brantwood School included there. So phase 2 is the land use design options phase, and we're beginning work in this phase immediately. We've retained the consulting firm Planning Alliance to help lead this work. And they'll be doing things including a background review, key stakeholder interviews with the residents associations, Halton Healthcare Services, and owners of adjacent properties, such as the medical buildings, the Oakville Curling Club. And their key task is to come up with 3 conceptual land use design options for the site that will be presented at a public workshop that's targeted for May. And that workshop will be used to discuss and evaluate the 3 land use options that the consultant creates based on all of this input gathered to date. The consultant will prepare a summary report that's targeted for June 2011, and then staff will host an open house in September, and followed by a public meeting and a recommendation report, which is targeted for October. So that's the end of my update, and the recommendation is just that the report be received.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Questions? Are there, we have a delegation listed for this. Mr. Craig Hunter? Welcome, Mr. Hunter. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you, Mayor, members of Council. I intend to be brief. I'm here on behalf of the owners of 331 Shedden Avenue. Pardon me?
I gather you're not Mr. Hunter.
I am Mr. Hunter.
You are Mr. Hunter.
Excuse me.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got confused very fast there.
Well, there's another hand pop up in the background. Again, it's Craig Hunter, Armstrong Hunter Planning Consultants on behalf of the owners. We're delighted that you're moving forward with this study. We participated in the workshop. We participated last June, actively monitored things, and we have been working with the owners and Bill Hicks, the project architect, to come up with a residential design concept for the medical facility property, which we think will be entirely fitting. Our concern was expressed last week by our solicitors. There is an outstanding appeal on livable Oakville, simply on 3 points. If the expanded notion, and it was in fact clarified today by Ms. Gilwood and Ms. Anderson, if the expanded study area included, one, a broadening of the special policy area that's in livable Oakville, that had some concerns to us. If the policy, if the initiative expanding it also involved the reconsideration of the general underlying residential land use of the medical facility property, that caused us some concern. Opening up to discussion of height, built form, et cetera, parking, that's all reasonably appropriate in our view. And thirdly, if it meant holding up or precluding in any way the sort of natural consideration by staff and council of an application, which we've had pre-consultation meetings on, that was expressing some concern. So the owner solicitor wrote a letter seeking clarification, but I even saw from today that that doesn't appear to be the case. And that's what we're here to ensure. We wanted to be on the record for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the clarification. You saved me some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the public with information for council on this matter? Mr. Canham, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here representing the Trafalgar Chartwell Residents Association. I just want to go on record to let you know that we support the approach, and we're delighted that the study area has been expanded to include Brantwood, the curling area, and the medical building up to the north. You can expect our full cooperation. I would like to make 2 requests at this point. With the March break coming up and many of our members on the board on vacation or have business commitments elsewhere, if we could be interviewed sometime towards the middle of April, that would be great. And the other request I have is it possible to obtain a copy of the terms of reference so we can see from what point of view the consultant will be approaching this exercise? We have some of our own thoughts, and there's no point in us going off on a tangent if it's not in sync with what...
The answer is yes, you can have them.
Thank you.
And yes, you can have your consultation in the period you ask.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Canham. Are there any other members of the public? In that case, I'll look to council for a decision. Councillor Giddings. Councillor Giddings moves the staff recommendation of receipt. All in favor? Opposed? That carries. Now that brings us to a possibly historic moment, and that's item number 9 on our agenda, the notice of intention to designate a property at 3065 Seneca Drive, and I believe Mr. John Laird, the owner of the property, is here. And the reason I say it's a historic moment is I'm not aware of an owner-initiated designation application before. And so I thought in recognition of the possible special nature of the occasion, we'd start with Mr. Laird, and I'll start by thanking you
Well, word's very kind. I'm assuming there's no monetary attachment to that, or monetary gift attached to that. Although perhaps with Susan's help, we can work on that in the future. My name is John Laird, and I live at 3065 Seneca Drive with my wife and son. I want to thank the Mayor and Council for the opportunity to preserve our little piece of Bronte through the important heritage planning process. We have met with town staff on several occasions, and staff were very helpful and professional in detailing the benefits and obligations of designation. Their research and report have provided much new information about our cottage. We agree that the preservation of this relatively simple structure provides context and connection to Bronte's past as a common man's community. After reviewing staff's report, we would like to request that the fireplace and its enclosure be included in the official record of designation. Town staff has documented these elements and I believe agree with this inclusion. Again, thank you for your consideration of including our home in the important and continuing work of preserving Oakville's heritage in all its varied forms.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm sure we can accommodate that. I'm not seeing any disagreement from staff. They're agreeing. Any other members of the public on this item? Thank you. Now, do we need to make any modification of this to accommodate the fireplace? No, it's done. Then I'll look to Councillor Johnston for the motion to adopt the recommendation from staff. Any discussion?
No, I'd just like to move it and thank John for taking the initiative in this program.
All right, all in favor? That carries. Council, you have a confidential discussion item, a report from the legal department. Can you act on that now, or do you wish to go into camera? You want to move it? Yeah, I'll move it. All right. Thank you, Councillor Elgar. Councillor Elgar moves adoption of the recommendation in the legal report. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. And I can now, I think, state what it is, right?
Yes.
Ms. Baker? Having adopted it, I can now state what it was, right? Because by
Yes,
having
sir,
voted
you
on
may.
it becomes public. The recommendation adopted was that the town not participate in the appeal by Javeed Khan before the Ontario Municipal Board regarding Committee of Adjustment Decision CAV A184-2010 at 3134 Scotts Craig Crescent. Now, Council, I draw your attention to the Advisory Committee minutes before you and item 10 of the agenda, and the recommendation that the item 6A of the Heritage Oakville Advisory Committee minutes be approved and the remainder of the minutes received. Councillor Knoll. Councillor Knoll moves that. All in favor? That is carried. Now, if one of you would please accommodate me with a motion to rise and report. Councillor Elgar, all in favor? Thank you. I rise and report that the Committee of the Whole has met and has made recommendations on public hearing items 1 to 5, discussion items 6 to 9, advisory minutes item 10, and confidential discussion item C1, as noted by the clerk. And we need a mover and seconder to adopt this report. Councillor Duddick and Councillor Johnston, all in favor? That is adopted. Now, a mover and seconder for the bylaws would be very welcome at this point. Councillor Robinson and Councillor Lapworth. This is the authority for the bylaw to declare that certain land is not subject to part lot control in Bronte Creek community. That's 2011-25. And the 2011-30 bylaw to confirm the proceedings of a meeting of the council. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you for your time and attention. And we are adjourned.